I'm Brad Wolf, and welcome to Dire Dan, and I have something different for you guys today. Today I'm going to be using Dugneon Scrawl. Dugneon Scrawl is a website designed for making dungeons. Super intuitive and easy to use, and it's free. Let me say that again. Free. Now, Dugneon Scrawl did not endorse this video. I'm just using it because it's an easy way for me to teach you how to draw dungeons. And that's the plan. I'm going to show you 4 basic layouts to help you get your dungeons started and get those creative juices flowing and get you drawing your own dungeons for your Shadowdark and Dungeons & Dragons games. So what I'm going to do in this video is give you 4 basic layouts that I typically use when I'm designing dungeons. And you can mix and match these layouts. You can do very elaborate versions of these layouts, but I'm just going to give you simple, straightforward 4 different layouts. Now, the first one is just a central room with a hallway wrapped around it. Once you draw your hallway wrapping around your central room, you can add some hallways coming off of that to connect it to other wings of the dungeon. So for this wing of the dungeon, I'm just adding some rooms around this looped hallway. And what it does is it creates a nice centralized location surrounded by supporting rooms. So the central room could be the wizard's laboratory or the wizard's library, and then the surrounding rooms could be his living quarters and the living quarters of any of his apprentices, and then other rooms that might support the wizard and his enclave. Now, before I move on to the next dungeon shape, I want to give you a couple quick examples. This one's from the basement of Castle Bone Hill from the Secret of Bone Hill Advanced Dungeons & Dragons adventure. But you can see it's a variation on this same concept. And here's a round version from a DYSON Logos map. If you're not familiar with DYSON Logos, Google his stuff. He's got great dungeons that you can use in your adventures. Now, the next layout is also going to be a central room, but then that central room is going to get divided up into sections. So most of your modern homes or apartments have a floor plan something similar to this, where there's a centralized open area that is then subdivided into living space, dining room space, and kitchen space. So you get a central area divided into thirds, and then bedrooms are wrapped around that central area. You could use your own house or your own apartment and copy that floor plan and use it for a corner of your dungeon. And then we're going to add some hallways coming off of that floor plan, again, to be able to connect it to the rest of the dungeon. Now, the third basic shape is modeled after old Christian cathedrals. So essentially, it's one long, narrow room, which would be like the worship center of the church or temple, with 2 small prayer rooms or baptismal rooms on either side, and then an altar area, and then a vestibule or entrance area at the opposite end of the temple from the altar area. The reason these Gothic churches had this particular shape is because it makes the shape of a cross. That's not really relevant for fantasy setting, but the shape stands out in most Western people's minds as a temple or cathedral. So this provides just a very recognizable shape. But again, we want to make this usable space, so we're going to have a wing coming off of it, and this is where maybe the high priest's living quarters would be. So we have a group of rooms that would be the priest quarters, and then we're going to have a hallway coming off of that. And that's where the acolytes and the other members of the temple have their living quarters. And of course, there's real-world temples all over the earth, and you can find floor plans for those and use those as inspiration for your fantasy temples. So here are some more examples. This is from the Lost Citadel of the Scarlet Minotaur, designed by Kelsey Dion from Shadowdark. And this one actually has 3 different variations of the temple room in this one particular map. Now, here's another DYSON Logos map. It also has the temple design, but if you look up here at the top, it's going to have our next design that we're going to be talking about. 2 large rooms connected by a T intersection. And here's a Shadowdark example of that, again by Kelsey Dion. This is the Horde of the Seawolf King from the Cursed Scroll Zine number 3. But once again, you can see 2 large rooms connected by a T junction. And this can be used in any situation where you might have 2 rooms of almost equal importance. So as I'm drawing this one, I'm thinking of a king's throne room and maybe a great hall for dining and festivals and celebrating and that sort of thing. So this might be something that would be inside a keep or a castle, but essentially it's 2 large rooms connected by a T intersection, and then I'm going to build a wing off of one of these rooms, and this might be a collection of rooms for the king's private quarters. Then on the other room, I'm going to wrap a group of rooms around the outside, and maybe these are the other important rooms at the center of a castle or a keep. The most important thing here is you're giving yourself some simple starting points to get the creative juices going. But then once you start thinking about what this place used to be and how people lived here here and what they use these rooms for, then it starts to take on a life of its own. And that's ideally how you want to build your dungeon, is think of its history, what was it originally built for, how did people use it, and what did they do when they lived here, and what kind of rooms would they have needed. And now that I have these 4 different wings of the dungeon completed, I'm going to connect them all with large hallways. This helps create the looping and branching paths that are so necessary for the exploration part of the game. Now that I've completed those hallways, I've given myself large blank areas in between those loops. So now I'm going to fill those in with a few more rooms. And then while you're planning your dungeon, you can think about what these rooms are relative to the 4 quadrants that we already developed. So these rooms over here near the temple area might have been lesser shrines to other deities. Because this is a polytheistic fantasy setting, you might have a large temple dedicated to one god and then surround it with smaller shrines dedicated to other gods. That's just one example I can think of off the top of my head. Lastly, we have this large open area, which I'm going to make the servants' quarters. And then I'm going to add a bunch of secret passages because of the people who lived in this fortress believed that servants needed to be out of sight, out of mind. And that gives us a simple historical reason to have secret passages everywhere. Then in the middle of the servants' quarters, I'm going to add a sitting room. Maybe each of these 4 rooms slept 2 or 3 servants, and then they had a common room in the middle. This design also prevents things from always being so square. So there, that finishes the dungeon, and now I'm going to export it so you can see the whole thing in one wide view. Now it's just a matter of adding the entrances and filling it up with monsters. Now when it comes to monsters, everything I've been talking about so far is what this fortress used to be, how these rooms were designed and what they were designed for. But that doesn't mean the fortress is still being used that way. But now it's ruined and there's been new inhabitants, and maybe over the years there's been a history of multiple inhabitants. And this is what really makes it a dungeon. So maybe that top quadrant was originally the wizard's laboratory, but maybe now a group of ettercaps live there and they shepherd their giant spiders, and those giant spiders are mutated by the residual magic that was the wizard's laboratory. And maybe the great hall and the throne room are now occupied by a tribe of goblins led by a group of bugbears. And now a pair of bugbear sisters sit on the thrones that used to belong to the baron and the baroness. And maybe the top quadrant is haunted by the knight who failed the baron and the baroness and failed to protect the family, and now he's cursed and roams the hallways in endless torment. And then recently, a cult has decided that they want to take over this fortress and cleanse the temple and restore it to its former glory. So that bottom right quadrant is now full of these cultists trying to fight back the ettercaps and goblinoids. So that lets you see how having a history of a place can lead to a story, and that story can lead to new events, and those new events can help you define what's living in the dungeon and why they're there now. And then that helps inform what kind of traps or puzzles or exploration encounters you want to include in the dungeon as well, so that it fits the theme but provides all 3 aspects of play: combat, exploration, and role-playing. Now make sure you hit that like button to help out the channel, and subscribe if you haven't already. Use the comments to ask any questions you have about building dungeons, because I'm definitely going to continue this dungeon design series. So if you see an adventure that you recognize scrolling across your screen right now, make sure you check out the next dungeon video. Check out the links below so you can see the final version of this dungeon, and links to Arcane Library where you can find Kelsey Dion's Shadowdark Adventures, and a link to DYSON logos and his wonderful maps. And click here to keep watching more videos. But as always, I'm Brad Wolf, and thanks again for visiting the Dire Den. I'll see you next time.